Welcome to this episode of the Australian Naval History podcast series, where we examine an event or an aspect in the Royal Australian Navy's history. The Naval Studies Group at the University of New South Wales is supported in this series by the Royal Australian Navy's Sea Power Centre, the Australian Naval Institute, the Naval Historical Society of Australia, and the Submarine Institute of Australia. Hello, I'm Commander Alastair Cooper, Deputy Director of the Sea Power Centre Australia. This episode is the second of two devoted to one of the most heroic groups ever to serve in Australia, serve Australia in war, the Coastwatchers of World War II. To discuss their story, I'm joined by Mr Jim Burrowes, who's the last surviving radio operator from the Coastwatcher organisation. Jim, we're really glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
By Vice Admiral Peter Jones, retired, who wrote the book Australia's Argonauts, which is in part a discussion of the lives of Eric Felt, who ran the Coastwatcher network, Rupert Long, the Director of Naval Intelligence, and Hugh Mackenzie, a Coastwatcher. Peter, thank you for joining us. And by Dr. Betty Lee, a great niece of Eric Felt, who is writing a biography of her famous relation. Thank you for joining us. And finally, by Mr John Perryman, the Royal Australian Navy's Director of Naval History and Strategy. John, thank you also. Peter Jones, if I can turn to you first. Perhaps the Coastwatchers' finest hour was their role in the Solomon Islands campaign. Can you outline the strategic situation and the role that the Coastwatchers played?
Certainly. So, as part of the same Japanese operation to lodge an invasion force at Port Moresby, which Jim talked about in the previous episode, a smaller Japanese force did succeed in landing in Tulagi in the Solomons. This lodgement, combined with an airfield that the Japanese were then started to construct on nearby Guadalcanal, threatened the sea lanes between Australia and America, as well as to New Guinea. The US decided to conduct an amphibious operation to take Tulagi and Guadalcanal. And so, as was explained in the last episode, Eric Felt had established a Coastwatcher network in the Solomons, and this proved invaluable in a couple of ways. First, and quite unexpectedly, as a means of reporting Japanese aircraft proceeding south from the Rabaul area to attack Allied ships off Tulagi and Guadalcanal. So you had successive Coastwatchers on the different islands as the aircraft tracked south. They would report the aircraft as they went past them. And this enabled the ships off the two amphibious landings to be ready, and critically, US aircraft from the US aircraft carriers offshore to launch and be at a higher altitude to engage the Japanese aircraft when they arrived over the amphibious area. And this helped defeat many raids. The second contribution was for the Coastwatchers to rescue downed aircraft, airmen, and also shipwrecked sailors. And during the campaign, over 100 aviators and 180 sailors were saved. And this included the future President John F. Kennedy. And finally, and once again unexpectedly, the Coastwatchers led local Solomon Islanders in attacks on Japanese forces. And the Solomon Islanders had been enraged by the Japanese brutality shown against their kinsmen, and proved themselves to be willing and skilled fighters.
Thank you. John Perryman, one of the Coastwatchers in the Solomons was the remarkable woman, Mrs Ruby Boy. Can you tell us her story?
She was remarkable indeed. Ruby Boy and her husband Sco were working on the Santa Cruz Island at a place called Vanikoro, and there was the Cowrie Timber Mill. So they were there before the war, and they had a radio operator in place with a teleradio. So they were ideally suited to, take on this role. Now, when war was declared in 1939, the assigned radio operator, he had a desire to go and do his bit, so he left to join the Royal Australian Air Force, and it was he that suggested that Ruby, at age 50, and with no prior experience in any of this, should be able to take over the teleradio. And she proved herself to be completely competent in every way. Not only did she learn how to use the equipment, she taught herself Morse code, and she began sending her intelligence and messages, sometimes up to 4 times a day, reporting the Japanese movements around the Solomons. So she had a big part to play in that. She also had played a part in the Battle of the Coral Sea, where she provided intelligence there. Now, can you imagine, she made a bit of a nuisance of herself. The Japanese are monitoring the airwaves. They're listening out. They're quite accustomed to hearing, radio reports from the men. But there's this woman, amidst all of this chatter, if you like, who they quickly decide they need to do something about. So you can imagine how Ruby must have felt when, calling Mrs. Boy on Vanikoro is received on her set. And a measure of the person she was is she's quoted as saying, "I felt just a little bit queer when I heard the voice, but somehow I felt he was bragging. The mere fact that I was annoying them sufficiently to have them warn me off was somewhat gratifying." And that was this remarkable woman. She remained on the island. They sent naval forces down to Santa Cruz to try and land, but they didn't have the local knowledge to penetrate the surrounding reefs. So she lived to fight another day there. And then, of course, as the war progressed and the islands were liberated, conditions became somewhat better. But she was one of these remarkable people who felt so concerned. Eric felt so concerned was he about, her longevity, that they actually parachuted a uniform to her. They made her an honorary third officer in the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, in a fairly tenuous hope that were she captured, she may be afforded some sort of legitimacy. For her efforts, she received the British Empire Medal, and she received a personal call when Admiral Halsey dropped in by Catalina. So a remarkable woman in every sense.
Thank you. Peter, Lieutenant Commander Hugh Mackenzie, who was at Rabaul, was posted to the Marine headquarters on Guadalcanal. Can you tell us about his role and how the activities of the Coastwatchers changed as a result?
Yes, so Eric felt and Rupert Long quickly realised the importance of the Solomons campaign and the importance of having someone who could bring together and coordinate the Coastwatcher activity on Guadalcanal, noting that the Marines had their headquarters there, and also to ensure that the Marines could help logistically support the Coastwatchers so they can continue to do their work. The logical choice for such a at times difficult job, as it turned out, was Hugh Mackenzie, someone who had experience as a Coastwatcher and they knew very well. And so Eric came in and worked in the headquarters to do those two things. There was some difficulties for him and a lot around personalities within the headquarters, which we probably don't need to go into here. But he did a great job in just trying to coordinate what the missions were for the Coastwatchers, ensuring that that they got adequate supplies. When the Marines were replaced by the Army, General Alexander Patch took command. He could see that there had been issues, and so he directed that Hugh Mackenzie report direct to him, and he made it very clear to his staff in no uncertain terms that any request from Hugh for logistic support and supplies to the Coastwatchers be given as a matter of priority.
Thank you. Betty, Eric Felt was able to visit first Noumea and then Guadalcanal, and he met, I think, Admiral Halsey in Noumea. Can you tell us about that tour?
Yes, yes, certainly. In March 1943, he went on this visit, and he did meet Admiral Halsey in Noumea, and thanked him for the excellent work that the Coastwatchers were doing. And then Eric went on to visit Hugh Mackenzie and see the setup at Guadalcanal, and he found it was all functioning well. But this was in stark contrast to the situation the Coastwatchers had been going through in 1942. Anyway, on the morning of the 20th of March 1943, he climbed aboard a small seaplane in Guadalcanal bound for Malaita. When they were getting close, Eric got a severe chest pain. The pilot landed but then turned around and flew back to Tulagi Seaplane Base. From there, Eric was taken by a motor ferry to the Naval Hospital on Tulagi, where the doctor diagnosed a heart attack. And all things considered, it was not surprising that the stress and workload that Eric had been under resulted in him having a heart attack. Because 1942, it was a whole new situation. And there'd never been a coast-watching system like the one that began in earnest in 1942. And he had been out of the military for 17 years and only back in for a couple of years. And he was really commanding by the seat of his pants, really. It was the year where Australia was in the gravest danger, and he was well aware of that. And he was well aware how important the Coastwatchers were. And I think the thing that was most telling on him was that he had to ask people to stay behind in enemy-infested territory and jungle-ridden, disease-ridden jungles, and then he had to send new men into the field too. And there were many were people he knew personally, and many were his friends. And it must have been quite, I think, upsetting to see the Coastwatchers when they came out in the sorry state that they were in after the service that they'd been doing, and then to learn of the deaths of the others, such as Bill Kyle, his best friend. And then the best organised action that they'd had was in December 1942, and it was been almost a complete failure, with 4 out of the 16 having been killed, and the remainder driven out or in danger. And this happened when the Allies, they planned to recapture New Guinea with Coastwatcher support, but it backfired because the Japanese invaded before we got to do it. And so then again, the Coastwatchers were behind enemy territory. Anyway, Eric previously had suffered from scrub typhus, which had been nearly fatal. So we're very fortunate that he did survive that and lived on to be head of the Coastwatchers. It might have weakened his condition a bit, and smoking wouldn't have helped his coronary arteries. But I think it would have taken an extraordinarily strong man not to be deeply affected by what had happened during 1942 and what had happened to his Coastwatchers. Anyway, General MacArthur organised for him to be sent to Brisbane as soon as his health allowed air travel, and about a month later he was flown to Brisbane with a naval doctor in attendance. And Commander McManus took over as head of the Coastwatchers. The Navy promoted McManus to acting commander, and they demoted Eric to lieutenant commander. It was a blow for him, but he took it on the chin. He wrote in his book, "It seemed harsh, but what the hell? Ferdinand was delivering the goods, and that was all that mattered." And he lived quite life for another 25 years, which suggests that probably it was the stress and the strain that related in his heart attack. But whatever the reason, I think we were lucky to have him at the helm of the Coastwatchers, and also that he lived to write their story.
Which we might cover in a bit.
Yes.
Betty, thank you. That's, again, quite remarkable. Jim, I think you might have met Lieutenant Commander, Acting Commander James McManus. Can you tell me what he was like?
Yes, Alastair. Actually, Betty's mentioned a bit about him in respect that he took over as supervising intelligence officer when Eric had his heart attack. But I found him with some awe. He was a big boss, and had a fairly intensive interview with him at Hindhoff House in Queen Street, Brisbane, where they were the headquarters. I never met Eric, unfortunately, but McManus, he was, as I say, very dour. And he was an Irishman, and he checked me out on Morse code. Morse code, was a dot and a dash, da-da, dot for the d and dash for. So I still know my Morse code, da da di di da 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 di da di di, except that that's the alphabet, but I won't go through it all. It's amazing how it sticks. And
you've got a communicator alongside you who'll probably be joining.
Yeah, it was also interesting that the, a dot is just a dot and a dash is just a dash, but. I found that when we were dealing with the AWA civvies in Moresby, I could tell who was on the other end, and likewise they could tell me. I mean, one of them was quick and fast, the other was whatever. It's just like a signature. It was amazing, and it's only a dot and a dash. I appreciated then with McManus, getting back to McManus, at the end of the war in November, I received a very nice personal commendation about how, I'll be honest, how good I was as a radio operator and volunteer and all that. And but he got one thing wrong. He said how I was good technically. Do you know, in the 6 weeks that we learnt Morse code, not one word, not 1 hour, not 1 minute did we learn anything about the technical side. One day up in the islands in Japanese territory, damn wireless wouldn't work. I thought, what the hell do I do? And I pulled it out of its sheath, turned it upside down. I thought, all these valves and God knows what condensers, and it was a sunny day. I turned the radio on, turned upside down, hoping something happened with the radio on, and you wouldn't believe it, I had a brown paper lunch bag of spare parts. So I picked out the red and the green and the yellow and the red and shorted them across, got a signal. To this day, I don't know how I put it together. I'm sure I didn't use my teeth. I didn't have any soldering iron or didn't have any pliers, but I got the damn thing working. And without that, we would have been mute. We would have had to somehow organise through another party somehow to get another radio dropped. But I appreciated the commendation by Eric, by McManus. And I just wanted to correct him on that, but I didn't bother.
Betty, the Coastwatchers also played a role in the operations along the north coast of New Guinea, in addition to the Solomons. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yes, Alastair. It seems to me little recognition has been given for the important part the Coastwatchers played in the eventual success of the Allies at the battles of the beachheads in November 42 to January 43. The beachheads of Buna, Gona and San Anandra became the battlegrounds after the Allies fought the retreating Japanese across the Kokoda Trail. Almost the double number of soldiers died at the beachheads as at Kokoda.
Terrible waste of time, waste of lives.
Yeah. But the Allies had optimistically thought that success would be achieved quickly, but the Japanese kept sending supplies and troops to reinforce the battle area. Coastwatcher Lyndon Noakes was stationed near the mouth of the Mambare River, 40 miles northwest of Buna. The Japanese were sending supplies to Buna from Salamaua by barge at night and hiding them during the day. So if the Coastwatchers could find out where they were hiding, that would be very useful. And also, in order to improve their supply line to Buna, the Japanese planned to establish a bridgehead at the mouth of the Mambare. And if that was successful, it had the added danger that enemy troops could be taken up the Mambare in barges and swing south and attack the Australian flank. Anyway, one day Lyndon heard our planes strafing the enemy barges, and he headed through the jungle to investigate. The pilots had done considerable damage to the barges, but he made the greater discovery that they had indeed landed and set up a camp. So he got back to his camp and sent the message, and the next morning the Allied fighter planes came and did it over. However, the Japanese weren't daunted. They got their stores and removed to a new location. So he set off through the jungle, and undetected he discovered the new encampment, and he reported that, and our fighters came back and strafed that as well. So more barges landed, more sites were made by the Japanese, and he discovered them. So over a month, he and his party just undermined these efforts of the enemy. And he was often like only half a mile from them, so it would have been so easy, you would think, for them to spot him, but they didn't. Anyway, so the Japanese eventually gave up and pulled out, and the bridgehead never eventuated, and so the potential damage to the Allied soldiers was eliminated. But there was another factor as well. At the beachheads, the Japanese had built an impenetrable network of bunkers and trenches, and they were well hidden, and the Japanese had kept them with great tenacity, and it took a heavy toll on the Allied infantry. So they called on the Coastwatchers Perryman ship to help, because they needed tanks and heavy artillery to attack these impenetrable bunkers, and they couldn't get them over the Owen Stanley ranges or fly them in by plane, but they could bring them in by small ships. But there was a catch. The waters between Milne Bay and Boona were full of reefs, and it was uncharted, and the Navy was going to survey it, but that would take months. So Eric was asked if Perryman could lay buoys and place lights, and he assured General Headquarters that Perryman could do that. And with Ivan Champion in command of a crew of coastwatchers, Perryman travelled up the coast at night and moved into inlets in the day, but sometimes had to be out in the daytime. And each reef was marked with a buoy, which a light could be hung on, so that they could guide the ships at night. And the Japanese in Boona took no notice. They just thought it was an insignificant vessel bobbing around, and little did they realise that it was going to have a significant part in their downfall. And so that made way for the small ships to carry the heavy artillery up. And in December, Perryman was followed by small ships that sailed up to Oro Bay. And they did this for over a month, night after night, and tanks and field guns were landed at Oro Bay, and really helping our hard-pressed infantry to put an end to the Japanese at Boona.
Thank you. Jim, you had some experience along that northern coast of New Guinea. I'm just wondering if you can explain to me two things. One, what the environment was like and what your experiences were. But I was also wondering if you could reflect a little bit more. We mentioned in the previous episode that a coastwatching organisation was not just the coast watcher and the radio operator, but also the local people. So as you talk about the north coast of New Guinea and your experiences there, I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about the local people as well.
Yes, Alastair, I served at Milne Bay and then forward bases in Nadzab, which was a big US Air Force base, and then up in Madang, where the Australians had landed there, and they were forward bases for the parties that were already up in the Sepik and Wewak. I then finished there and flew down in coincidentally a Beaufort bomber down to Moresby, and then I went by seaplane, a US Mariner, to the south coast of New Britain, then up by barge and into the jungle. Environment was always we had, and I'd like to pay homage to some native troops, not quite the environment, but they're always with us doing the thatched shelter and what have you, cooking our food, even occasionally doing a bit of washing, most importantly climbing the tree to put up our aerial. As I mentioned before, they were one of the essential components of the coast watching parties. So that pretty well covers my movements in the north coast. But the natives, they were just wonderful. We soon, because we lived with them, we soon learnt pidgin English. Long time before me stop long place, or we call him Rebel now, man belong Japan. You come in now, shoot him, and etc. etc. It was sort of a very simple descriptive language, but we soon learnt that to communicate with them. They were wonderful. In the end of the week, we'd give them some twisted tobacco, and that was their pay, I'm ashamed to say. So, they were, and I've recently an article which was posted in Papua New Guinea talking about the value of the native troops. They were our environment.
Thank you. John Perryman, the coastwatching organisation had some great characters. Some of them we've already mentioned, but can you tell us a bit about Blue Harris and his fate?
Well, Blue Harris I touched on in the earlier episode of this podcast concerning the Coastwatchers, and just as a reminder, Blue played a fairly significant role in the evacuation of Australian troops from the north coast of New Britain following the Japanese incursion. So he gets them with his... what would be the
Lakatoy.
The Lakatoy was the ship, that's right. But he had, a collection of motor launchers, a fairly irregular navy, and this enigmatic character is the captain of that navy, if you like. So he's a bit larger than life, and as I say, he's a big fleshy guy with red hair, but he is really driven to be in the fight. So after all of that excitement with getting out of New Britain, he then goes on to see further excitement at the Rye Coast, which is between Madang and Finschhaven in New Guinea, before eventually finding his way back to Queensland at Tabragalba camp, and that's where he is in 1944. But Blue, with his head for adventure, he's not a happy camper. He wants to get back into it, so he's putting his hand up and itching to get back into the fight. So, of course, by this stage of the war, we're now firmly on the offensive. We're sort of hopping along the top coast of New Guinea, westward. Mm-hmm. And the next place that we've got our eyes set on is Hollandia. So Blue is selected to lead a party of 11 to go to the Hollandia area, be landed by the United States submarine Dace, go ashore and start providing some of the vital intelligence necessary, which would precipitate the landing at Hollandia. So when they go in there, they've made this arrangement that Blue Harris will go in first. So the submarine will come to the surface, launch a small boat, Blue will go in, and if it's safe for the others to follow, he'll give the code word to come on. If he felt that there was any reason that they should not come, he was going to give the code word wash out. And when he got there, he had difficulty in the surf. He got there, he was immediately greeted by islanders, and the bells in the back of Blue's head started to ring. He was alarmed at, how quickly he was noticed. So he did, in fact, signal washout, but it was too late. The others had left the submarine, and the other members of that 11-man party then joined them. They spent that night in the jungle, concealed. They hadn't been compromised at that point. But the next morning, Blue was quite convinced that, they may have been in peril. So they struck inland. And his instincts, would serve him well, because it wasn't long before they became surrounded by elements of the Japanese army. They were machine gunned, shot at with carbines, mortared, and the party was soon split up. So at that point, Harris and two others of his party kept the enemy at bay for 4 hours before his two colleagues were shot and killed. The remainder of the party had scattered into the jungle and made good their escape, so that they're pretty well now without their supplies, without ammunition, and facing the hardships of the jungle of New Guinea, and that was the common enemy here. But sadly, Blue Harris was captured by the Japanese. I think he recognised that he was mortally wounded. He gave nothing up to them, and in the end, they lost patience with their interrogation. He was put against a tree, and he was bayoneted. posthumously, he was awarded a mention in dispatches, but it's very, very interesting that when the others eventually made it back to safety in a terrible state, some of these men who managed to hook up following the invasion of Hollandia, when they came out of the jungle in this desperate state and told the story, which Felt relates in his books. Clearly, Blue Harris was this young fellow with a head for adventure, and he sold his life dearly in the end.
Thank you.
John, do you mind if I just add a bit of personal information there? I knew Blue very well at Tabragalba when that happened. I was selected to go with him as a radio operator into Hollandia. At the last minute, a previous signaller, Jack Bunning, who had dropped out because he was sick, got better at the last minute, so he came back into it. When, as you mentioned, the two parties that went in and lost everything and the surfeit that they hadn't seen from the submarine, that's when my substitute, Jack Bunning, got killed. So it could have been me, but it wasn't. And yes, I just want to add that.
No, I'm thrilled that you did, and I've described Blue as being a fairly a character. Is that how you found him?
Absolutely, yeah. He was a great guy. Apart from the wonderful work he did at the North Coast, he was just a character. You can't describe him. I think a red-headed Irishman would be enough.
Larger than life.
He wanted a job. He got it. Unfortunately, they tortured him and killed him, bayoneted him at the tree, while Jack Bunning got killed by a gun battle. Thank goodness I wasn't in it.
Thank you both for describing it to us. Peter Jones. As the war moved north into the Philippines, the work of the Coastwatchers was largely finished. Can you provide us with, some facts and figures that give a sense of their contribution to the war?
Yes, so we touched on in the previous episode the fact that their work in terms of saving the members of Lark Force. Then in the Solomons, the fact that they saved over 250, possibly up to 300 Allied aviators, sailors. They also saved innumerable numbers of expatriates as they were withdrawn. So as Coastwatchers were withdrawn from islands, they brought with them expatriates. In some cases, as some that Betty has talked about, they remained, but they helped facilitate expatriates to leave. So these are really key contributions. The thing that also isn't talked about as much is going back to the Solomons, where there were almost like these private armies under some of the enterprising Coastwatchers who had the Solomon Islanders as their troops, if you like. Hundreds of Japanese were killed as a result of that, and they frightened small detachments of Japanese from even patrolling. So they were very significant contributions in material terms, both in terms of the Solomons and also New Guinea.
So just add that they, after a while, they stopped being Coastwatchers, they became guerrillas.
Yes, that's
Guerrilla
right.
Fighters, yeah.
And there was some discussion at the time about, hang on, this is within, Eric and Rupert about, well, is this what we want it to happen? It wasn't what we originally envisaged. But the circumstances had changed. And in the Solomons, it was, really I think the right decision to allow this to occur, because they really made significant material impact on the campaign through their work.
Just as a minor point, for some reason the natives in Guadalcanal were called Scouts, but they were just the same.
Yes, that's right.
John Perryman. Rupert Long and Eric Felt worked hard to have the bravery of the Coastwatchers recognised by Australian and US authorities. How successful were they?
I think they were very successful, and there's a couple of really interesting points that I'd like to make. You know, there was almost 50 decorations variously awarded to the Coastwatchers, which included, you know, Ruby Boy as the only female. They also saw that the islanders were recognised as well with loyalty medals. Okay, somewhat different to the imperial system, but, you know, recognition was given out quite, you know, generously. But I think the main point to take away from the decorations won by Coastwatchers, it wasn't for a single moment in time where caution was thrown to the wind and a brave act occurred. And that's not taking anything away from when that happens. But these men were decorated for months and months and months of bravery in the face of the enemy in some of the most arduous and challenging conditions that one could imagine. So, you know, they did fight hard. I think both Felt and Long and others saw this group as very, very much a family, if you like, of fighting men and women, and included in that family, of course, with the islanders. So, yes, and I think it was, you know, some of the awards, the highest of which was, you know, a Commander of St Michael and St George. 21 members received mentions in dispatches, and Distinguished Service Crosses were handed out, as were other decorations. Also, the Americans, you might recall that we've heard previously about Halsey and how he saw the Coast Watching Organisation. The Americans were also quick to recognise the efforts of a number of Coast Watchers.
Thank you.
Can I just add that the Americans wanted to recognise by medals of the, including myself, the people that worked behind in enemy territory, but it was knocked back by the Australians. Now the Australians did do quite a few medals, including natives. So I want to credit that, but the American ones were knocked back. Anyway, that's beside the point.
Thank you. Betty, even as the war was still being fought, Eric Felt was writing his classic book, The Coastwatchers. Can you explain the impact of the book?
Okay, well, the book The Coastwatchers was published in 1946 by Oxford University Press, Melbourne, and a smaller book was published in the same year by Oxford University Press, New York. I think the book showed Eric's talent as a writer, and it recorded his personal knowledge of the Coastwatchers and the significant events in which they played a part. His descriptive prose and his candid opinions and his lively sense of humour make the book a most readable story. But perhaps one thing he did was downplay the importance of his own role and the demands it placed on him. But he was a relatively quiet and modest man, I believe, and it was just in his nature to do so. The Australian newspapers at the time, the reviews were positive, with many glowing in their praises. Here are a couple. The Argus in Melbourne said, "It has a dramatic suspense of 100 adventure stories. This is one of the great untold stories of the war." The Advertiser in Adelaide said, "These men helped save Australia. This fine book, dealing with so vital and nearly tragic period of our history, well written, should be read with pride by all Australians." And the Mirror in Perth said, "Unsung Australian heroes defied outwitted Japs. Here is a story of Australians who deserve to live in the memory of their fellows. Every school, boy and girl should read it and marvel that the moment found such men." The impact at the time obviously hasn't lasted with the passage of time, because in my experience, hardly any Australians know about the Coastwatchers, and even fewer know about Eric Felt. It seems the only people who do know are those who have lived in Papua New Guinea, members of the military, and some historians.
His book became the Bible, written with meticulous detail, and interesting that after he took ill and stopped writing in October, subsequently he listed another addendum of several pages to wrap up the story. It's a great book.
Okay.
I got an original.
Yes.
Thank you both.
Got it from me mum.
Peter, Rupert Long, ever the organiser, wanted a permanent memorial to the sacrifice of the Coastwatchers. What ended up materialising?
So in 1948, Rupert Long suggested to Gordon Laycock, who was the director of lighthouses in New Guinea, that one of the new lighthouses which were being built along the coast after the war should be built from a public subscription as an enduring memorial to the Coastwatchers. So in typical Rupert Long fashion, he had established a Coastwatchers Memorial Committee. He had some of his team, like Brooksbank and other people that had worked for him for many years. They populated the committee and they did the work under the broad sweep of Rupert's direction. They were very effective. Madang was selected as the site, which was very appropriate because of how Madang figured both in Eric Felt's life in the interwar period, but also in terms of the contribution of the Coastwatchers in that area. The donations were large and small. They came from Australia, New Zealand, UK, and also America. Some of the key donators were Admiral Halsey, Vice President Richard Nixon, who had served in Guadalcanal area as a young officer. Construction of the futuristic-looking lighthouse. It looks a bit like a rocket, and it got underway in early 1959, and it was unveiled on the 15th of August that year. The event also served as one only reunion of the Coastwatchers. Rupert had organised a RAAF aircraft to ferry key VIPs, key people from the intelligence world and Coastwatchers from Australia. The US Naval Attaché in Canberra, who at that time had an aircraft, he had served in Guadalcanal as an aviator. He provided his aircraft to ferry people. And also there were many expatriates and 40 native Coastwatchers from the highlands and mainland New Guinea, and also the outlying islands descended on Madang for that weekend. The lighthouse was switched on that evening of the 15th of August by Senator John Gorton, who was Minister for the Navy at the time. Eric Felt gave a very moving speech, and that night a reunion was held at Hotel Madang. In fact, one of the Coastwatchers foresaw what the events that night would be, and that dead Japs would lie 3 feet high around the bar in Madang Hotel with all the stories. One Coastwatcher called them the reunion of Eric Felt's gang, and another said that evening was so fantastic we never thought we would see each other again. And Jim's point about how a Coastwatcher team was the radio operator, the Coastwatcher, and the native support team. On many of those small teams were reunited on that weekend for the first and only time.
Thank you very much, Peter. Jim, you were unfortunately unable to attend the opening, but you have made a subsequent pilgrimage to the memorial light. What are your feelings?
It's interesting. I was never told you about that, otherwise I might have been there. But coincidentally, on a cruise my wife and I did up to Japan and back, we called in at Guam, and then next stop was Madang, where I was for 6 months anyway, on Billy-O Island, just across from where but I took the opportunity to go up and see the lighthouse, and I was very impressed. I had a little quiet moment thinking about poor old Blue and Jack Bunning, and on the side thinking I'm glad it wasn't me. But it's very interesting to see 38 names of Coastwatchers that didn't make it. 38 out of about 400 represents just, if you like, a fairly small percentage, but bearing in mind our strict mandate, as Betty pointed out before, was not to confront the enemy, just to keep and hide and spy on the enemy and report movements. They're the ones that unfortunately got caught, including one of those 6, Les Carlson, who was captured and killed with John Murphy when he was captured in New Britain. So one of the 6 of us got killed as well, yeah. So that's just an aside that Blue and the other names were enshrined in that nice memorial.
Thank you. To conclude this remarkable story, I'd like to give each speaker a chance to give their final thoughts about the Coastwatchers. And I think, given that we're talking about Coastwatchers, Jim Burrowes, it's only natural that we would turn to you first.
Thanks, Alastair. I appreciate that. I might have mentioned the previous one, but it's important. What I've said at 96, my mission now is to let all the people know in Australia the importance. The main article I've written in my website was how the Coastwatchers turned the tide of the Pacific War. That was so significant, it's hard to understand, but I want everyone to know that. And generally speaking, if anyone's interested, if they just think of TLC as a code word, but then that stands for The Last Coastwatcher, no spaces. Go to Google, put that in, you'll find that article. Of all the articles I've done, probably about 20, that is the most important. That's the key one of the Coastwatchers feats that I want everyone to know about. Not to mention, of course, the famous saying by Bull Halsey, how the Coastwatchers saved. So that's my session. Thanks very much, Alastair and fellow interviewees. I've enjoyed reminiscing these occasions. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Jim. And look, say for everybody, it's The Last Coastwatcher. If you search for that online, you'll find Jim's website, which is excellent. And we'll certainly see what we can do to link to it to let people know.
Yeah,
Betty,
appreciate that.
Okay, well, I full-heartedly support Jim's goal to have the Coastwatchers more recognised and more known about them and the important role they played. And I think it would be really wonderful if we could have a memorial to the Coastwatchers here in Australia. It's fine to have one in Papua New Guinea, but how many Australians go there? Whereas so many people come here to the Australian War Memorial. I just think a dedicated memorial to the Coastwatchers would be very nice.
thank you. John?
Well, I think that the coast watching story it stands out in the annals of the Australian Navy's history. It was important at the time. When one looks at the geographic picture to our north, where we have New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, the Solomons, the New Hebrides, one wonders today whether in the future there might be a need for a similar organisation, notwithstanding the fact that we have other means of intelligence collecting now. But eyes on the ground, I think, prove that it worked exceptionally well. These are our nearest neighbours. They're our friends. Who knows? Some food for thought.
Peter Jones.
At the base of the Coastwatch Memorial Lighthouse is inscribed a poem, and it ends with the words, "They waited and warned and died that we might live." And I think that sums up the role and the contribution and the sacrifice of the Coastwatchers. They were truly the bravest of the brave.
Regrettably, that is all we have time for this episode. I'd like to thank John Perryman, Peter Jones, Betty Lee, and particularly Jim Burrowes, the last Coastwatcher. Thank you all for joining us. And for more great Australian naval history, just search for Naval Studies Group wherever you found this podcast. Goodbye for now.